And now, marine weather around Alaska.
This Monday's sea ice analysis. Sea ice free along much of the Arctic coast. Still have this area of thin ice concentration here over this stretch near the barrier islands there and just to the north. And that really hasn't changed much over the last couple of days and probably won't see much change in the next couple of days there. And on to tonight's forecast. This weak low pulls into Bristol Bay, rain across southern Alaska, becoming cloudier and increasing chances of some moisture there over the southern panhandle, dry in the west. System here keeps it kind of unsettled there for the eastern Aleutians back to Adak and Atka. And then that even weakens further tomorrow, Tuesday, with a front with a narrow band of light rain, fog, and drizzle there into the Alaska Peninsula. Cloudy, wet here over southern Alaska, and some showers in the central interior extending off to the eastern Brooks Range. And chance of showers or light rain across all the southeast coast with definitely cloudier skies. And then even cooler temperatures and more rain here over the southern southeast coast. Mostly cloudy and occasionally damp here across much of the central and southern interior. To a lesser extent over the upper Tanana Valley and 40 Mile Country. Even some showers over in the Copper River Basin. Some rain back out to the west here, dry for the north slope. Big storm with gale and storm force winds coming in toward the east central Aleutians. Looking at the coastal water forecast for the south coast here. The Panhandle, south winds 10 to 15 knots. Central coast, south at about 15. And the north coast, east-southeast, 15 to 25 knots. Lynn Canal, south winds 10 knots, seas 2 feet. Stevens Passage, southeast at 10. Southeast 15 for Clarence Strait. For Wednesday, Clarence Strait south at 15, and the south coast here southeasterly is 15 to 20 knots. East southeast 20 for the north or for the central coast. The north coast east 20 to 25 knots. And for Prince William Sound, southeast winds Tuesday at 20 knots with 4-foot seas or 3-foot seas, give or take there. North Gulf Coast southeasterlies 20 knots, 5 to 6-foot seas. Barren Island south at 20 knots. And Kamishak Bay, small craft advisories, southeast at 25 knots, southeast 20 knots, southern Cook Inlet, north of the Forelands, northeast of 15. And for Cook Inlet on Wednesday, light southerly winds at about 10 knots, light and variable for Kamishak Bay, southeast of 15. For the Barren Islands here, eastern North Gulf Coast, south to southwest at 15 knots, and south at 10 for Prince William Sound. Kodiak Island, small craft advisories, southwesterlies at 25 knots, 5 to 7-foot seas. And Bristol Bay, west winds at 10 knots. Otherwise, kind of variable winds here for the Alaska Peninsula at 10 to 15 knots. And then for Wednesday, gales coming into the western Alaska Peninsula, southeast 35 to 40 knots. And Bristol Bay, small craft advisories developing, southeast at 30 knots. Kodiak Island, east to southeast winds, 15 knots. And for the western Aleutians tomorrow, northeast winds 25 knots. Central Aleutians, Adak and Atka, north to northeast 15 to 20 knots. And east winds at 25 knots for Unalaska Island. And then storm force winds for the eastern Aleutians on Wednesday. Southeast 50 knots, seas 9 to 29 feet. And north winds at 45 to 50 knots for Adak and Atka with seas 18 to 23 feet. And 40 to 50 knot winds as far west as Amchitka Island, and then north to northwest from Kiska to Shimia, north to northwest at 30 knots. For the southwest coast tomorrow, north winds 20 knots. St. Lawrence Island, north winds 20 knots. Same thing for Norton Sound. St. Paul, St. George, St. Matthew Island, northeast winds 20 knots. And then for Wednesday, small craft advisories for the Pribilofs, northeast at 30 knots, north 30 knots, St. Matthew Island. And the Kuskokwim Delta Coast here to about Nunivak Island, southeast at 30 knots. Yukon Delta Coast, northwest at 15 knots, northwest 15 for St. Lawrence Island, north at 15 for Norton Sound. For the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, Tuesday, east winds at 20 knots with seas at 4 feet, and southeast at 15 knots for the western and central Arctic coast. For the Chukchi Sea, variable winds 5 to 10 knots with 1 to 2 foot seas. And for the Chukchi Sea on Wednesday, north winds 10 to 15 knots, southeast at 15 for the western Arctic coast, central coast, east at 15 knots. And the east side there, looking at east and northeast winds at 20 knots with 4 foot seas.